Welcome to Attacking SMS. My name is Luis Miras. I'm an independent security researcher, and this is my co-presenter, Zane Lackey, senior consultant at ISEC. I want to thank everyone for showing up here so early at 10 a.m. I know it's hard for a lot of us. I know it's hard for me. I want to say a special thanks to all the non-feds, because none of us get up this early. I know feds do it all the time. That's cool. No disrespect to them, but it's hard to be up this early. So in order to thank you guys, we're going to start off right away with a demo. So we're going to show you what we have right now, and then we're going to step through it a little bit later and explain what's going on and have some more demos at the end. You're going to be seeing two iPhones on here. These are not simulators. We're using VNC to forward the display to a computer so we could do recording. There's an attacker on the left-hand side and a victim on the right-hand side. This is going to show how we're bypassing carrier spoofing protection for MMS. This is our proof of concept code. The to field, we're using a fake number. We're using 5551212. We hard-coded our real numbers in the code, but because we didn't want any of you guys to have our real phone numbers. So we're using the from field. We're setting it to a trusted carrier number. Most carriers use 611 for customer service and internal stuff like that. And we're crafting up the message, which we're going to send over to the victim. And the victim, you see, we have the contacts open just to show you that there were no contacts on there that would make it appear that it was a spoofed number. Things are going on over the internets and over the networks, and stuff's about to happen. So there you go. We have a message from 611 telling us that we have a free $20 credit and that we should log into evil.com to get our credit added to our account. We're going to be covering what we did to get to this point, what the steps are, and then we'll go back and look at this quickly to after we have the knowledge of how this happens, and we'll add a little extra, and then we have an extra bonus on top of that at the end. So this is what we're going to be talking about. Zane's going to start off with the SMS background, and then we're going to cover testing challenges in attack environment. This is useful if you haven't done work in mobile phones. Maybe you're a pen tester. Maybe you work with web apps, or you do reverse engineering. These are the things that will get you up to speed to be able to test and be able to duplicate some of these attacks. After that, we're going to cover different types of attack. There's implementation attacks against specific MMS, SMS clients, and then configuration vulnerabilities and general architecture stuff. And then we're going to wrap it up. So now I'm going to hand it off to Zane to take care of the background information.
Good morning. So first of all, right off the bat here, we want to just make it clear that we're talking about GSM networks. We're not talking about CDMA. We did all our research on GSM. So what are we talking about when we say SMS? Well, SMS is really like an overloaded catch-all term. It really refers to all different types of messaging that we looked at here, whether it's the kind of basic text-only SMS, to graphical MMS, to other types, things like EMS, which was kind of a precursor to MMS that only a couple different manufacturers supported. It's really been phased out. But the point here is that SMS is kind of an overloaded term, and that it refers to a number of different types of messaging. It functions pretty straightforwardly from kind of a high-level attacker's perspective. On the left, we have Bob, who's our sender, and on the right, we have Alice, who's our receiver. And the message gets crafted on Bob's machine, and he writes it up, and he hits send, and it goes to the carrier's SMS server. And the carrier's SMS server is called the SMSC, right up here. And the SMSC routes the message down to Alice. Now, SMS is called a store and forward system, and the reason for that is, as you might imagine, the recipient is offline a lot of the time, or out of coverage area, or things like that. So the SMSC, its job is to actually store the message when it first receives it, and wait until the recipient is online, it can confirm that the message can be delivered, and then it forwards the message down to the recipient. So things get a little different when you're sending messages between carriers. To the user, it's still the same. But what's going on behind the scenes are each carrier internally represents SMS differently usually. And so when they need to transition a message between the two, they need some way to communicate. And that way to communicate is usually email. What they do is they take a message that was stored in one format, it gets converted to email, then it gets converted in the second carrier to whatever internal format they use, and then finally delivered to the recipient. As you can imagine, this matters a lot to attackers, right? Say you've got a message that is specifically crafted with very specific bitmask header fields, very specific bytes in your attack payload. What happens when that message gets converted to email and then converted to another format? Your attack is probably hosed. So this really matters. Next is MMS, and you notice that the graphic is completely different in terms of explaining it. That's because to the user, MMS still really looks the same to a user, right? You take a picture of something and you send it off to your friend and it goes through like an SMS. What's going on behind the scenes is a lot different in MMS, and there's a lot more actually going on here between the carrier and the recipient and the sender and the carrier. So why is all this actually interesting? There's a couple really cool things about SMS in terms of attacking it. The fact that it's always on. So SMS is delivered over the control channel or the paging channel to mobile phones. And that's the way that the carrier tells a mobile phone that it's got an incoming call and really core functionality like that. So this is a channel that's always on, right? You can always deliver SMS to a mobile phone. In addition to that, how many people here have done like a network pen test? Right? Really? Come on. How many people here have really done a network pen test? Yeah, it's the whole room probably. So you probably heard kind of the old joke saying that the only secure computer is turned off. The funny part is how this doesn't actually even apply to SMS because of that store and forward system. Let's say you're sending an attack to a victim. The carrier is going to make sure of the fact that your victim will get that attack, right? It's going to wait until your victim is back online and deliver your attack, which is pretty cool coming from like a network pen testing background. Another thing that's cool about it is the amount of attack surface and functionality. What started out as a technology that was really basic text-only messages, now you have everything like ringtones, you have things like MMS that support fully graphical images and video and audio and things like that. So the attack surface has really opened up in SMS. And then a few other things. Number one, attacking SMS has become much easier, right? Think back to the old phones that you had, the first couple generation phones that you had. Those were running custom operating systems. They probably varied even between minor releases and everything. Imagine trying to write exploit code for one of those. It was a massive pain. You had to be like a domain subject expert on each individual OS. And it was really a pain to actually, say you had found a vulnerability. To actually exploit it was really a pain. What's the trend now? Mobile phones are moving towards commodity operating systems, right? Windows Mobile, Linux, OS 10. I mean, how many more people have experience exploiting Linux, OS 10, Windows Mobile than they do exploiting a custom Motorola operating system, right? It's much easier for attackers now. And then finally, the functionality in SMS, this is something I'm going to cover in the next few slides, but the lower layers of SMS for a variety of reasons are, they're harder to mess with. You can't really do too much to them. But the functionality, this new functionality is being built at higher layers that you have full control over as an attacker. So the layers kind of map to, for those of us from a networking background, you can kind of map them like this. Let's say you're on a host and you're trying to attack another host, but you don't have raw socket access. So things at the IP and TCP layer, you're probably not going to really be able to do much with them, right? But you can sure attack that host via HTTP, right? You have full control over that. It kind of maps like that in SMS. So what makes this all possible? This is probably the first time at Black Hat that we don't actually want you to pay attention to the hex and everything in the screen. Really what we want you to take away from here is the stuff in blue is the SMS header, and that's mostly off limits to attackers. And the part in green, the payload, is where your message goes. And when you write a basic text and you write in your message, that's where it goes. But that's also where this higher functionality that's being built at the higher layers starts out. And it all relies on something called the user data header, or UDH. And the user data header is a set of headers you can put in at the beginning of the payload, and it will define all this additional functionality. So it defines things like MMS, ringtones, multi-part messages. So when you send a message that's too big to fit in a single text, what it does is it breaks it across text. It inserts a UDH at the beginning of each and says, this is a multi-part message, this is message 1 of 2, this is message 2 of 2, and when it receives all of them, then the recipient phone stitches it all back together. This also clearly allows for a new set of attacks because these are all at a higher layer, and you have full control over this layer. So these are a couple example UDHs. We just wanted to give you guys a feel of what they actually look like. It's a few bytes. It goes at the beginning of the payload. The top one is one of those concatenated multi-part messages I was just talking about. And the bottom one is port addressing, which is something we'll address later on. But basically, it's a few bytes that you have at the beginning of your payload there. So our testing environment. The goals of our testing environment, we have to do three things to be able to do testing. We have to be able to send messages. We need a way to actually encode the messages into the format that they're actually sent out in the network on. And we need a way to receive messages. So how many people had dial-up access to the internet first? Yes? OK. Remember those AT commands that you had to mess with? They never went away. They're still here. They're in mobile. So what you're trying to get to, your goal for your ability to send is to get to the serial, the AT interface in your GSM modem, whether your GSM modem is a phone or a normal modem. So there's a few ways you can do it. The easiest way is to buy one of these. It's just a USB GSM modem. It costs us like $100 on eBay. It's great. You just plug it in, and you can connect to it with Hyperterminal or Minicom or whatever. And right there, you can just drop in and start typing AT commands. If you're impatient and you can't wait for it to ship, what you can do on a lot of phones is a lot of phones actually expose their serial AT interface if you know how to ask for it. So if you have a serial cable that connects to your phone, you can often reach it. Or this phone, my old feature phone, if you tethered it via Bluetooth to your laptop, it would expose the serial interface. So you could just tether this to your laptop and then start throwing AT commands at it, which is really pretty cool. Now remember how I mentioned the SMS stuff was kind of off limits? You can't, that blue headers you can't really mess with too much. The reason for that is the GSM chip inside of here, the thing that you're talking to via AT commands, is completely black box to not only you, but to some phone manufacturers. It's really the people that make the GSM chip. What they do is they hand off a set of AT commands and say, this is how you talk to us, and that's all you're allowed to do. So if that GSM chip doesn't like the message that you handed in there, it just doesn't send it. It says, nope, sorry, that failed my error correction here in this field. I'm not sending it out. And it does that a lot when you start messing with a lot of the headers in the SMS layer. The interesting thing, we assume those would all be pretty similar. When we were doing testing, what we noticed is some modems allowed certain things out that other modems didn't. So when you're running into cases where the phone rejects, the AT command rejects what you're trying to send out, try another modem, and it might work. What is the difference between this modem, the GSM modem, and this phone? They would allow different header lengths to be set. So encoding and decoding the messages, when you're actually passing a message to that AT command, it's referred to as a PDU. So that's basically that raw string of hex that's going on there. That's called a PDU, and that's how the SMS is represented. You need some way to actually encode to that standard, to hex. There's a tool that we linked in here that's really helpful when you're getting started with this. It's called PDU Spy, and it will allow you to set a number of different options, and then it will output that raw string of hex so you can then throw it into an AT command. When you start getting down into some really specific testing, quite honestly, you're doing it by hand. You're manipulating the messages by hand, and you're setting individual headers. But PDU Spy is pretty cool to get you started and get you kind of understanding it. Some of the things we're going to talk about later require binary XML, a WBXML. So we linked in a tool here that allows you to convert just an XML document to the binary XML format. Receiving messages. This is actually a harder problem than you think it is. When you receive a message on your phone and it displays up on your phone, there's two things that have happened by then. A, the phone has decided that you should be allowed to see that message, and B, the phone has probably changed some things about that message. So as a tester, obviously you can't do testing like that, right? You need to see what actually came down to the phone and see that raw PDU that came down. So there's a couple different ways we solve that issue. First of all, the easy way was just get one of those GSM modems again, and you can just query the incoming message via an AT command and check out the PDU that way. The other way that we first did this, long before we got the GSM modem, was we used an old school phone like one of these old Nokias. And these old Nokias, because they don't have internal phone memory, what they do is they save the message out to the SIM. So what we do, I think you guys will appreciate this, we would put this phone next to an unshielded speaker, and when the speaker started going haywire, we knew a message had been sent down to the phone. We'd pull the battery from the phone, pull the SIM out, and then we'd slap the SIM in a SIM card reader. This is $30 on eBay. And then we could put it in the laptop and just read the raw message out of the SIM. And we modified a Python tool that we link later on. To be able to do that, you can just click on the SIM and extract the raw PDU from that. So with that, I want to hand it back to Luis to talk about our attack environment.
So these were the goals that we had for our attack environment. SMS is pretty much unreliable. There's been lots of times where, especially during busy times, let's say New Year's Eve, you send a text to your friend and it doesn't show up for like 4 or 5 hours. So we didn't want to rely on the carrier to send messages because of the unreliability. We wouldn't know if it got dropped because of the carrier, if it got dropped because it was a bad format, if it got dropped by the phone. So we were trying to move towards being able to fuzz locally on the phone, as many people are working on this. So the cost too, even though you can get unlimited texting on phones, even in prepaid plans, one of the problems is that if you're sending thousands of test cases across this, your account's probably going to get dropped. It's going to get flagged. And we also wanted the ability to analyze issues, to be able to debug and look at logs and sniff traffic. So we took a look at having a virtual MMS setup. This was originally done by Colin Milliner. And we had Apache set up with Canal, and you do a couple modifications, add a new MIME type. And originally, he used this to be able to fuzz Windows Mobile 5. And we found out that Windows Mobile 6 turned off listening for WAP push. And there's an undocumented registry key that we found that will turn it back on. So you go to this registry key, and it lists all the ports that it will not listen to over Wi-Fi, and you just delete it if you want it to listen over Wi-Fi. So MMS provides a lot more attack vectors. There's message headers. There's different types of messages. There's SMS. There's WAP. There's WSP. It's all that's part of MMS. On top of that, you have a markup language similar to HTML called Smile. And then you have the rich content. Images and video. We've seen vulnerabilities in pretty much every image library, libtiff, JPEG, PNG over the past few years. So these were some of the challenges that we encountered for Windows Mobile. Pretty much you're at the mercy of ActiveSync if you're doing Windows Mobile. The debugging is pretty hard. The new version of IDA is actually really useful. They fixed a couple things that were wrong with it, so you can actually start to debug. There's some problems though. If you're trying to debug a live MMS connection, even though when you set up the ActiveSync, you can ask it to not route the internet connection through your computer, and it doesn't matter if you set that or not. It will not pull down the MMS content from the phone. It deactivates the cellular data connection, so you can't debug a live MMS. There was other problems. They use XIP binaries, execute in place, so you can't step into those. You can analyze them statically. There's a couple tools listed here, so you can pull them off and look at them in IDA. So we took a look at iPhone 2.x, and there's no MMS support in 2.x. GDB is, Apple has their own version of GCC and GDB because they still have to support the mock kernel. And a lot of the releases lag behind what's currently available. So this is based on a 2005 release. We found problems with GDB server, not being able to connect. Sometimes it works, sometimes it wouldn't. And when you're debugging Comm Center is the main process on the iPhone to deal with all the communication. It processes text messages, phone calls, Wi-Fi. And there's lots of timers and watchdogs on this. So if you're sitting at a breakpoint and you're trying to look at memory and you sit there too long, it's going to kill the process and start it over. And you're going to lose everything you had. Then we took a look at the 3.0 betas. It uses the same GDB, so all the same issues persist from 2.x. In the 3.0 betas, we were encountering crashes anytime we set a breakpoint in Comm Center. This could be because of the jailbreak that was used in the betas, or it could be that something changed. We're not really sure about that. We discovered a workaround where we'd turn off security, set breakpoints, and depending on what we were doing, we'd turn security back on or leave it off. So now we move on to attacks. This is one of the first implementation flaws we found. We were looking at Android, specifically at the concatenated messages. Concatenated messages have a sequence number. You can think of concatenated messages kind of like IP fragmentation or TCP fragmentation. there's too many messages to fit into a certain size, so it gets broken up. So the valid sequence numbers go from 1 to FF. So we sent something with a sequence number of 0, and it crashed the phone process. So this would temporarily not allow you to make or receive phone calls or send or receive SMS. But this was the process restarts fairly quickly, and it doesn't have a big user impact. We sent this off to Google, and it was fixed in Cupcake. Before the release of 3.0, the only choices for MMS on an iPhone was swirly MMS on a jailbroken phone. This is another DOS, but this one is actually really cool. What happens with this is you send a certain corrupted message, and it will kill the phone, be able to receive calls or make calls. You can't send or receive text, but you're not notified. You still have full bars, you still see a data connection, and when you try to make a call, then you see it all drop, and you can't make a call. So what do? You try to reboot your phone, restart it. You reboot your phone, it comes back, you still can't make a call. You try it a couple more times, and you can't make a call. The only way to clear this is to take the SIM out of the phone, pop it into another phone, have it register to the network, and then you can put your SIM back in the phone. So what's happening with this actually is that it receives the message over the air, and it crashes before it can send an acknowledgement to the SMSC to let it know that it got the message. So the SMSC thinks that the message never got processed, so it keeps trying to send it over and over, and it will continuously crash the phone. They were really good when we gave them the report for the bug and fixed it relatively quickly, and we just wanted to say thanks to them. This is a vulnerability that's not ours, but it's an interesting vulnerability because of how it comes into play. There's 3 different groups really that work together to get you a phone. You have an OS vendor, like Microsoft makes Windows Mobile, or Symbian, or whatever. And then you have an OEM. These are the people that actually manufacture the hardware, put the OS on there. They also do certain configurations, maybe write some drivers. And then you have carriers, which want to make certain changes to your phone to be able to allow them on your network. So these 3 different groups of people all affect the security of the end product. This vulnerability is pretty much kind of like the holy grail of vulnerabilities. You point it at a binary that's located on a web server somewhere, send it this message over SMS, and it executes your binary without notifying the user. This happens, and because of certain permissions, it's actually configuration. The Microsoft recommends strict permissions on this type of messages. Specifically in their MSDN, they say, do not do this. No matter what, do not do this. This is not recommended. Bad things will happen. But all these phones shipped with this set. This allows any user to send this message. It doesn't have to be signed by the carrier or any other type of permissions. So if you have a Windows Mobile phone, we've been hearing some reports that it might have gotten fixed in certain versions of 6.5, but you should check these registry keys and see if you're vulnerable. But it's a sweet vulnerability. I mean, you just send a message, point it to your binary, and it executes. There's no DEP involved. You don't have to bypass DEP. You don't have to worry about offsets. You don't have to fingerprint the phone. You just send it. I'm going to pass it off to Zane and talk about architecture attacks.
So when we first started kind of diving into this research, one of the things we thought about was, okay, how much attack surfaces are actually going to be in SMS, right? The first thing you think about when you think about SMS is really basic text messages. What else is going to be in there? It turns out, and this is pretty interesting, that carriers use SMS as a way to deliver a lot of other functionality, a way to administer phones on their network. Because think about it, carriers need a way to send new settings down to phones. They need a way to send new functionality. They need a way to send alerts to phones. And what's something that all phones have in common, from like your most basic feature phone up to your really advanced smartphone? They all support SMS. So it makes a really great mechanism to do that. So we started looking into, okay, what types of messages are actually delivered over like specially crafted SMSs? And the first one that we first one that we saw were voicemail notifications. So when you get a new voicemail and your phone pops up a new icon or a new alert that says you have a voicemail waiting, usually that's delivered over SMS. And it's just a specially crafted SMS that says you have X number of voicemails waiting, and your phone sees that message and it takes action accordingly. So what we wanted to try out was crafting one of these messages and seeing what would happen. What happened? We were able to do it. What happens is these phones are really built on the assumption that these sort of special messages should only ever be generated and sent by the carrier. And the carrier's architecture seems to kind of be under that same assumption that only they should be able to generate and send these certain types of messages. So voicemail notifications, obviously not security impact, right? If anything, this is a bar trick. And if anything else, if there were less serious security researchers here, they may have messed with their friends for a week after figuring this out by sending new voicemails. Luckily, there's no less serious security researchers at Black Hat. So how does this actually matter in terms of security? Well, settings. You need a way to send new settings down to a phone. Now, the interesting thing about these is that what we found is that these are really only supported on feature phones. On smartphones, we didn't really see this functionality actually supported. But OTA settings allow you to set things like what's the browser's homepage, various MMS settings, various internet-related settings. So we wanted to try this again. We crafted our own message. We sent it through to our test phone, and what did we get? Not that. That. Now, this screen is a little bit scary for a few reasons. Number one, obviously we were able to send settings. But number two, how do you possibly know if this is from a carrier or from us? What sort of context do you get here? The context you get is yes and no. I mean, we have no idea if this is legit or not. And that really actually exemplifies something that's a much larger problem in mobile security, and that's security context, right? That the user should be able to, this message came not from a carrier number, not from some 3-digit special carrier number or anything like that. This came from just our phone, right? A normal subscriber number. You have no idea where the source of this message came from. You have no idea what settings are changing. What settings is this? You know what settings that we're actually changing here? We're changing the proxy value for the internet traffic on here so that all of this phone's internet traffic now routes through our attack server, and we sniff and man in the middle all of its internet traffic. You'd probably want to know about that. So we took that same kind of methodology of looking at these messages that should only ever be generated and sent from the carrier, and we went back and we looked through MMS. Because remember in the beginning, MMS had all those messages going on? So this is a high-level view of what MMS actually kind of functions like. The sender contacts the MMSC, which is the MMS server, and you see a few servers there. That's because there's a lot more stuff that really goes on in MMS. It contacts the server and says, hey, I want to send an MMS message. The MMSC says, great, give me your message contents. Give me the picture you want to send, give me the text you want to send, things like that. The sender uploads it to the carrier. The carrier's MMSC does some internal things here. This is where they do their spoofing protections. This is where they do, they check for known exploits, they check for malware, they can check for spam and phishing attempts. They take this content. In addition to security checks, they also do a lot of usability things, like they probably resize your image, they probably transcode it to another format, things like that. But they take that content, they do enough things on it that they feel safe with it, and they bundle it up, and when it's ready to go, and all these checks have passed, it notifies the receiver that there's a message waiting for them, and the receiver goes up and grabs that message. So, apply that same thought process to this. If these control messages that are going on here are just specially crafted SMS messages, just like voicemail and just like those OTA settings, what did we do? We generated our own notification. We wrote our own notification, and because it's just a specially crafted SMS, it just flows through the carrier, through the normal SMS server. It goes down to the receiver. The receiver knows what to do. This isn't just an SMS to it. It's a definition of functionality, just like the voicemail notification. It knows when it sees this specially crafted SMS, it knows to do something. And what does it do? It connects to our server that we pointed to in here, rather than the carrier server. So what's this content that I'm talking about here, where it's retrieving content? It's not just the message contents. That's actually what we thought in the beginning there, that it just goes and fetches that image or fetches that text. What it's actually fetching is a binary MMS file. It's usually just a file that ends in .mms, but it's made up of 3 major parts. It's made up of a set of headers. It's made up of some HTML markup, some SMIL markup, and it's made up of then the message contents at the end there, so the image and the text and things like that. What's in the headers? Things like transaction ID, version, message ID, and the date and the from. This message is hosted on our server. This message never went through the carrier checks. It's hosted on our server. We wrote whatever we want into this file. This means we control the from, and we can write the date. Sorry about that. So what this means, we control the from, we control the date. We can backdate a message if we want. We can say, oh, what are you talking about? No, I sent you that message last week that I'm going to be on vacation. Yep, there we go. You have full control of these fields that are in there. This means we've bypassed the carrier spoofing protections. This means we've bypassed the anti-malware protections, the checking for known exploits, checking for spam, checking for phishing. We defeated all of those by hosting the content on our own server and generating our own notification to point to our server that we control. In addition to that, we actually get a bonus out of this too. How is the phone fetching from our server? It's doing an HTTP GET. What do you see when someone sends an HTTP GET? You see the user agent. So here's a couple example strings of user agents. You can use this same attack to not only spoof and bypass those protections, but when the phone connects to you, your server, you see their user agent. And you see a couple other HTTP headers too that phones send. Now you can use this to fingerprint a remote device and say, oh, okay, it's running Windows Mobile, it's running Sony Ericsson, it's running whatever. Now I'm going to launch my targeted attack. In addition to doing the fingerprinting here, in our research, and we've only done relatively a small number of phones, I'd say about 50% or so connect automatically to get this message. Of the other ones, what they do is they prompt you and say, you've got a new message waiting, do you want to download it? Everybody likes new messages, right? They're probably going to hit yes. And in addition to that, a few phones that we've seen also, even while that prompt comes up and says, hey, you have a message waiting, they'll do a GET in the background to kind of fetch some information about it. Maybe they don't pull the message down yet until you say yes, but they want to fetch some information about it. So we've seen GETs before you even hit yes on the screen, and that GET contains all the info you needed. So another interesting thing here, you had to, when we're hosting our own file there, we obviously had to serve up the content for it. When you're fingerprinting, you don't have to serve up the content. You can just return a 404. And in a lot of cases, the phones, if they just get a 404 back for that message, they assume something went wrong, and they never even notify the user that you had a message waiting or anything. So it's possible to completely silently fingerprint a phone in some cases with this. So with that, I want to hand it to Luis to talk about our app.
So we're presenting Taft. 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 There's an attack for that. So Taft is our app that we use to launch attacks. It runs on Windows Mobile. It's a jailbroken app. It's a jailbroken iPhone app. We haven't submitted it to the App Store, or I don't know. I don't know if they'll accept it. But it covers a lot of the attacks that we've been talking about. The implementation and configuration flaws, the things like VM voicemail notification. And we have the MMS proof of concept that actually interacts with a web application. And we're going to step through that to show you how the spoofing actually works. So here's our app on the left-hand side, and we have our server. And we take all the content, the from, the message, the date, whatever it is, and we push it to our web app. The web app sends us back a file name. We take the file name and push the notification through. And then the phone grabs the content from our web app. It's all self-contained. You can spoof from the phone, and you just need the web app to serve up the file for you. Here's some screenshots of the application. On the left-hand side, you have a list of attacks, and then on the middle and the right-hand side, there's the drill down menus. You just have to enter a phone number, and for like the WAP push, the phone number and the URL of your binary, or the phone number and how many voicemail notifications you want. So it's demo time again. We're going to be stepping through really quickly through the first demo we did now that everyone knows how it's working. So you're going to see with the progress bar, you're going to see that it's going to set up a modem, and then it's contacting the server. So it's uploading all the content to the web app. The web app is going to pass back down the file name, and then we're going to send the notification. And there we have our message. The iPhone is actually very good to do these types of attacks against. The reason is that because the iPhone wants to look all nice, it has certain settings for MMS by default. It doesn't display the subject on an MMS. They want an MMS to look exactly like a text. So if you receive a spoofed MMS, you can't tell the difference between that and a text as a user on an iPhone. So we sent a message from 611. We wanted to try to send a message with a text field. So we just picked a name at random, just whatever, you know. And then, you know, thought about some random content, you know, just to test it out. Because I don't know about you guys, but I feel a little guilty jailbreaking my phone. I mean, Steve doesn't really want me to do it. And if I had the approval, if he told me it was okay, then I wouldn't feel guilty anymore. All right, we got a new message. We're going to drill down on it. And there we go. Steve Jobs is telling us to upgrade our phone and to jailbreak it. And if anyone from DEF CON is here, I think he's a size medium, so just let him know. Okay, so now that I showed you that, I have to tell you to not do this. So this is a carrier issue, and carrier is a little bit different than software vendors. We disclosed to them, we told them what was going on. They're working on a fix. It probably is going to still work for a while. And one thing to remember, it is their networks. They are watching their networks. They're probably monitoring their subscribers, and actually they are monitoring their subscribers. We were told that they're looking for this type of activity. So I would only try this on your own GSM network. If any of you guys own a GSM network at home, try it on there. Obviously, we haven't tested against all the GSM networks in the world. If anyone wants to fly us out for testing, we're available, especially if it's a warm country with beaches. So we reached out to the GSM Alliance. It's this organization that all the GSM carriers belong to. So we talked to them, and they're providing details to the different networks. And with an agreement with the carrier that we were talking to remove the proof of concept fingerprinting and MMS from the application. But where do you get the app? All the updates are going to be delivered through Twitter. There's an email address specifically for the app. While we were working on the proof of concept, we were able to send messages and do all kinds of stuff. Then we wrote a pretty GUI to wrap around it, so it would be fun, easy to use. And just like any proof of concept, it works great when you're testing it in the lab, and then you try to really use it, and it breaks. So we ended up with a bug that sometimes messages would take 10 seconds to send out, maybe 20 seconds, 30 seconds. That's acceptable. That's okay. But then we started getting things like 10 minutes. And 10 minutes to send a message is not acceptable. So we've been looking at a couple different fixes. We've actually talked to Anthony Lineberry. He's speaking 2 talks from now, I believe. And he hooked Comm Center to be able to access the AT interface. We were using a different interface, which is causing us the problem. We think his fix will work. We talked to him on Tuesday. And I believe he's releasing the source, so we're going to look at it and incorporate it in. We're looking to release at about 8:15. we didn't want to come here with vaporware. So if you really, really want it, and you understand that it might take 10 minutes to send out a message sometimes, go ahead and email us. We can send you a copy. It's unsupported. You have to install it yourself, la da 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 da, but it's there. So I'm going to hand it off to Zane.
Cool. So two things we want you guys to walk away with in terms of the attacks that we discussed. When we really started diving in and looking at those messages that should only be generated by the carrier and only sent from the carrier down to the mobile phone, in a lot of the cases, we found that as attackers, you can actually generate these messages yourself. The stuff we talked about today in terms of the MMS spoofing, the OTA settings, the voicemail notification, that's the tip of the iceberg, right? People are going to go back and relook at these specs and say, oh, that message looks like some interesting functionality. What happens when I try generating that? So we're going to start to see a lot more attacks based off this whole kind of attack class of generating these messages that only the carrier should actually generate. The other thing that we want you to think about is the interaction between the OS vendor, the OEM, and the carrier is definitely going to produce more security issues like the one that we saw in Windows Mobile. This is not, that's not the last security issue we're going to see from that. And it's just something to interestingly think about, because those of us kind of from the normal software vendor world are used to having, one vendor who's directly responsible for a product, and they're who you go to for a fix, and they're responsible for the security of that product when it ships out the door. And now there's a lot more to that process. Now with all three of them kind of agreeing or not agreeing on different settings before they go out the door. So just like the carrier messages, we're going to see more vulnerabilities here. This is definitely something that we haven't seen the end of. So
the bottom line is, attacking SMS in the past was hard. Attacking SMS now is much less difficult, and attacking SMS in the future is going to be even easier. Thank you for coming to our talk. We're going to open up the floor to questions.
Hi. I'm just curious why they haven't actually gotten around to blocking these kind of messages coming from the subscriber.
That's a really interesting question. The question was, why haven't they gotten around to block these types of messages? And to be honest, the networks to us are a black box. They don't really tell us how they run their networks. We just kind of guess by sending messages. I wish I had a better answer for you.
Are you sure that you can access the MMS files that aren't from the carrier network? Because I know on the iPhone, when they give you a URL to get a voicemail, for example, if you try to tell them to go to like a regular web server, it doesn't. It'll only go to one inside the carrier network.
And it's the same on Android. So when I try to like spoof the MMS server, that didn't work on, I think, like 4, 5, 6 carriers that I tested. So I'm really wondering why it's working today. Because normally the proxy only allows, the MMS proxy only allows to connect inside the own network. So I'm really interested in why it's working now.
It's working. I don't know what to tell you. It's working for us. We can talk afterwards if you want.
Yeah. But just one last thing. So you didn't use the iPhone though? On what carrier?
We purposely blacked out the carriers on the slides. We can talk later if you want.
Okay, that's fine.
Do we have more questions? Here we go.
Hi. You mentioned making a testing environment so you wouldn't need to connect to the carrier to test your SMS messaging on Windows Mobile. Were you able to do the same thing with the iPhone, or was that strictly carrier testing?
So no, we did not get the virtual testing environment working on the iPhone. I believe there's going to be another couple talks covering that after us.
So you guys implemented the development software on a jailbroken iPhone. Was the execution to target a regular iPhone?
It was the target phone was a jailbroken phone. because we needed to. I don't know. All my phones are jailbroken. It doesn't need to be a jailbroken phone. It just the MMS needs to be allowed by the carrier. That's all. Yes.
So it seems like you have to sequence the attack a little bit with the settings update. Do you get any indication when the settings update is taking place? Do you get like pings starting on the MMS server or anything like that? For the fingerprinting and the rest of the attacks, it redirects over to your proxy server. How do you know when the settings that redirect it to your proxy server have taken effect? Do you get any indication at all?
From the user side, or from the person using the phone, or from our server?
Or from the phone automatically or anything like that?
On the one that we tested, all we saw was yes or no, and if we selected yes, it worked, and if we selected no, it kept what it had.
Right, and from the attacker side, could you tell if they'd selected yes or no and it had taken effect and you could now execute your attack?
You start seeing traffic if you're the attacker with server. That's really how you know. I mean,
Okay.
we were just running TCP dump, and we looked on there, and all of a sudden traffic started coming in.
Okay, yeah, that's what
Yeah.
I was asking.
So you said something about you don't really have to have a jailbroken iPhone. As far as if it's not jailbroken, when you download the application, don't you have to have signing rights for that application to work? Do you know what I'm? Does that make sense or no?
So on a jailbroken iPhone, they remove they make everything that you sign work, no matter what key you have. That's how they release apps. All the apps on jailbroken phones have to be signed, but they don't look at the signature when it's jailbroken.
Do we have more questions?
So it's a broken iPhone, a jailbroken iPhone app, but you mentioned running on Windows Mobile. Can you explain what you're talking about there?
Oh, I made a mistake, I guess, when I said Windows Mobile. You can scratch that.
Okay.
Oh.
Any more questions out there? Just raise your hand. Looks like we got them covered. All right, thank you very much.